Before we begin our service today, we'd like to remind you that we will be addressing some sensitive issues in our liturgy as we mark the anniversary of the national apology to the victims and survivors of institutional child sexual abuse. Please prioritise your own care. Pastoral support will be available near the Peace Chapel following the service, and suggestions for any other support that you might need can be found in the back of your worship booklet today.
Marking the 7th anniversary of the national apology to institutional victims and survivors of child sexual abuse is confronting. We need to speak of challenging and painful experiences. While the Royal Commission was limited to institutional child sexual abuse, most abuse occurs in domestic environments. 14% of Australian adults have experienced child sexual abuse, 18% of women and 11% of men. 41% of Australian adults have experienced physical or sexual violence since the age of 15. 1 in 2 LGBTIQ people have been sexually assaulted. Beyond gender-based violence across the world, there is conflict at higher levels than we've seen since World War II. We're witnessing environmental trauma as a consequence of climate change. According to the World Health Organization, 70% of people worldwide experience one or more traumas in their lifetime. These are not just statistics, they're the experiences of our mothers, our fathers, lovers, children and grandchildren, siblings, neighbours, work colleagues, friends, and millions of others who we don't know personally. Such trauma disproportionately affects those with least power: children, women, queer folk, First Nations people and people of colour, economically disadvantaged, displaced people, and those differently abled. Trauma is not just an individual problem, it's a social problem, and it is an ecclesial problem. Many who come here on Sundays bring their own lived or living experience of trauma. I say living because for some, the past is alive in the present and continues to overwhelm. Serene Jones, the current president of Union Theological Seminary in New York, asks, how would a preacher preach if they were able to see the scars and wounds of those in their congregation? Would they preach differently? In my PhD research, I'm asking, as a congregation, our liturgies, pastoral care, and administrative practices can be aware of and sensitive to the life experiences of those who come. We must not ignore or silence the voices of those battered and bruised by trauma. We also need to recognise our biblical texts are full of examples perpetuating or colluding with violence and abuse. Abraham was asked by God to sacrifice his and Sarah's son. Lot offered his daughters to the Sodomites. God sent plagues upon the Egyptians. Innocent babies were slaughtered by Herod. Jesus was stripped, whipped, and hung on a cross to die, and the list goes on. Feminist biblical scholar Phyllis Tribble refers to the stories of rape in the Bible as texts of terror. And in our second reading this morning, we will hear a story that could be rightly called a text of terror. Depending on the Bible translation used, it's been titled David Avenges the Gibeonites, Justice for the Gibeonites, and the Great Famine and Execution of Saul's Descendants. Let me warn you, it is a gruesome story. So please stand as you're able and join in the singing of the hymn Ancient Words before we listen to the cry of the persistent widow from the story told by Jesus as recorded in the Gospel of Luke.
A reading from the Gospel of Luke. Jesus told them the following parable. In a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected people. And there was a widow in that same town who kept coming to him and pleading for her rights, saying,
Help me against my opponent.
For a long time the judge refused to act, but at last he said to himself,
even though I don't fear God or respect people, yet because of all the trouble this widow is giving me, I will see to it that she gets her rights. If I don't, she'll just keep coming and finally wear me out.
For ancient words, changing me and changing you. A reading from the second book of Samuel. During David's reign, there was a severe famine which lasted for 3 full years. So David consulted God.
Holy God, we cry to you in our distress. Why are we being punished?
Guilty of murder. He put the people of Gibeon to death.
The people of Gibeon were not Israelites. They were a small group of Amorites whom the Israelites had promised to protect, but Saul had tried to destroy them because of his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. So David summoned the people of Gibeon.
People of Gibeon, I want to make up for the wrongs that have been done to you so that you can bless God's people. What can I do to help you?
Our quarrel with Saul and his family can't be settled with silver or gold, nor do we want to kill any Israelite.
What then do you want me to do?
Saul wanted to destroy us and leave none of us alive anywhere in Israel. So, hand over 7 of his male descendants. We will hang them before the Lord at Gibeah, the hometown of Saul, the God's chosen king.
I will do as you ask.
But because the sacred promise that David and Jonathan had made to each other, David spared Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, the grandson of Saul. However, he took Armoni and Mephibosheth, the 2 sons that Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, had borne to Saul. He also took the 5 sons of Saul's daughter Merab, whom she had borne to Adriel, son of Barzillai, who was from Meholah. David handed them over to the people of Gibeon, who hanged them on the mountain before God, and all 7 of them died together. It was late in the spring, at the beginning of the barley harvest, when they were put to death. Then Saul's concubine Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, used sackcloth to make a shelter for herself on the rock where the corpses were. And she stayed there from the beginning of harvest until the autumn rains came. During the day, she would keep the birds away from the corpses, and at night, she would protect them from the wild animals.
Go away! Get Nathan! Leave them alone!
When David heard what Rizpah had done, he went and got the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan from the people of Jabez in Gilead. They had stolen them from the public square in Bethshan, where the Philistines had hanged the bodies on the day they killed Saul on Mount Gilboa. David took the bones of Saul and Jonathan. He also gathered up the bones of the 7 men who had been hanged. They then buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan in the grave of Saul's father Kish in Zelah in the territory of Benjamin, doing all that the king had commanded. And after that, God answered their prayers for the country. For the ancient words, changing me, changing you.
I warned you. The story from the 2nd book of Samuel is a gruesome story. Let's see what this story has to offer us as we mark the anniversary of the national apology. Mighty King David wanted to end the famine, so he approached God. As the story is told, God suggested that the genocide committed by Saul needed to be addressed. The Gibeonites at first refused retaliation, but when pressed, they asked for the blood of Saul's descendants. David readily agrees, hands over the 7 males to be killed, conveniently eliminating any rivals that could threaten his claim to power. But notice, the famine did not end at this point. Such retributive violence, often misnamed as justice, plays out in our families, neighbourhoods, and nations. I now invite Rizpah to come forward and share her story.
I am Rizpah. My father was Aiah, and I was a secondary wife of Saul, a member of the royal household, not a concubine, as often assumed. My children were legitimate and entitled to inheritance, and they were potential heirs to the throne. my two sons, Ammoni and Mephibosheth, were brutally killed, along with Merab's sons. Following their slaughter, I lost my status in Saul's dynasty. I was left economically and socially vulnerable. In my anguish, I was speechless, but I needed to mourn the loss of my sons and protect their dignity even in death. For 6 months I kept vigil. I could not forsake my children. The women from the village came to support me, to provide me with food and encouragement. They're not mentioned in the story, but I would not have survived for 6 months without them. Eventually, and it took 6 months, King David heard of my vigil. So he goes and retrieves the bones of Saul and Jonathan, who, like these 7 young slaughtered men, have not been honoured in death. Finally, he comes to me, and together we gave a dignified burial to all 9 men in the tomb of my father-in-law at Kish. Then, and only after the burial, did the rains come, and the country, ravaged by famine, begin to flourish.
I now invite the nameless widow in the parable Jesus tells in today's gospel to come forward. Let me call her Tivka, a Hebrew girl's name for hope. Tivka, as you listen to Rizpah, how have you heard her story?
Usually I'm referred to as the persistent widow demanding justice, but my name is Tikva. It's often assumed that the justice I'm seeking is related to my status as a widow. That could be the case, as Jesus didn't specify in his parable. But my demands for justice go beyond my personal circumstances. Today, I've been deeply moved by Rizpah's story of her tenacious and formidable call for justice. Rizpah, I can't imagine your suffering. Your 2 sons and Merab's 5 were offered as human sacrifice, supposedly in atonement to appease God for King Saul's violent genocide. What God would require such violent retribution to resolve the evils of the world? We didn't hear words, Rizpah, we saw your intense and public expression of grief. A large boulder gave you safety and security. You lay down sackcloth, a symbol of your grief, and gave a passionate testimony of your trauma and pain. For 6 months, you stood vigil day and night, honouring yours and Merab's son through your powerful ritual of mourning. With screams and tears, you told your truth through your body and your voice.
I had no words, but I could not let this atrocity pass in dishonour.
Rizpah, what happened to Merab, Saul's daughter and your stepdaughter? Your sons were forcibly taken from her by David, then handed over to the Gibeonites for ritual slaughter in atonement for Saul's genocide. In the story, we hear nothing from Merab.
Merab, dear Merab. Tivka, Merab remained silent forever. Like other victims of violence and traumatic wounding, she carried her ongoing suffering in silence, forgotten and hidden from view, as do the Merabs in our families, neighbourhoods and congregations, with their wounds continuing to fester.
I'm curious about something else. Many translations of the Bible have different titles added to the story, but none of them mention you, Rizpah. Is that another example of how our sacred texts silence the voices and actions of women?
You may be right, Tivka. I wonder how many people here have ever heard of Rivka before today. I wonder about the ongoing consequences, not only for faith communities, but for society more widely, if the biblical narratives are used uncritically. We need to interpret our sacred texts in our current time and context.
And that's what we're doing today.
Thank you, Tivka, and thank you, Rizpah. While this story, some 3,000 years after it was first told, what does this story, some 3,000 years after it was told, offer us, as we, like Tivka, want justice? Not just policies, procedures and training to prevent future harm, but to attend to the wounds of the battered and bruised in our congregation, our homes, nations, and across the world. Drawing on 6 decades of interdisciplinary trauma scholarship and more than 25 years of trauma theological scholarship, I've developed a trauma-sensitive lens consisting of 5 elements: trust, truth, love, justice, and hope. Cultivating trust, witnessing to truth, fostering love, pursuing justice, and nurturing hope. Over the last half of 2024, 11 people from the congregation participated in a contemplative theological inquiry to guide a trauma-sensitive practice of hospitality in this congregation and beyond. Very briefly, sitting in circle and listening to each other with open minds, open hearts and open wills, what we learnt was far greater than the sum of any of the individual contributions. The circle process offered a model for engaging in difficult conversations communally. From a theological perspective, we recognised our desire to welcome all, but that we cannot welcome all. Hospitality necessarily has to have boundaries for reasons of safety, capacity, and identity. Not impenetrable boundaries, but boundaries nevertheless. We recognised that forgiveness is widely seen as a Christian virtue, but too little attention is given to justice when harm is done. Not retributive justice, but justice to set things right, or as right as possible. There's no doubting that we're made in the image of God and all have inherent dignity. But how do we respond when dignity is violated? What are the consequences when dignity is squandered? I've also collated many suggestions offered to foster a culture of just hospitality, underpinned by an ethos of dignity and justice. Let me conclude with some wonderings. If instead of reading both the story in the second book of Samuel and the parable of Jesus as stories about individuals some thousands of years ago, what can these stories offer us if we read them and interpret them in our time and context? What if we understood the stories about communities, and in particular the faith community of Pitt Street Uniting Church? Could these stories offer us a way of speaking of and practicing trauma-sensitive hospitality, allowing us to take seriously not only the experiences of those living with trauma, but the lived living experiences of pain and suffering amid this community? How can we listen to and learn from the Rizpas and the Tivkas among us, and thus offer just hospitality? And beyond Pitt Street, are we seeing Rizpa in action today among those who are lamenting and protesting for those in Gaza?